Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the official Oscarina nomination coverage for Myst. Myst is a point-and-click puzzle mystery game developed by Cyan and published by Bruderbond, if I'm saying that correctly. It was released on the Macintosh computer in 1993 and was created by the Miller brothers, Rand and Robin, the latter of which also composed the game's music and did the game's art, and both of which play characters in the story. The concept of Myst involves an unnamed player character finding a book entitled Myst with a Y, and within one of its pages is a panel depicting a mysterious island. Once you touch the panel, you are transported into the book, into the world of Myst, and embark on a journey to uncover the secret behind worlds within books and the familial conflicts of those who create them. My name's Mitchell, and I'll be your host for the evening. Here with me is my good friend and co-host, Tom.
Hello, I'm Tom.
Myst is up for 3 awards, including Best Pixel 1993, Best Direction, and Best Technical Artistry. So, despite being among the smaller turnouts of nominations, Myst was actually a colossal success both commercially and critically when it released. It remains one of the longest best-selling PC games of all time, topping the sales charts for almost a decade, which is really saying something since it came out in the same year as the extremely popular Doom, also a contender this year. And so it'll be nice to sit down and actually talk about it. But we should probably start a little bit with like our experiences playing the game. So what was your kind of journey into playing Myst?
Yeah, so I had actually never played this before it being a contender for an Oscarina, but it's one of my partner's favorite games, and I said, oh, that's on the list for something that we can do this year. How would you like to play this with me? And she proceeded to not help me at all through the entire playthrough of that I did of Myst. So I had a lot of fun with it, but I was extremely frustrated by it for most of the time I was playing it. But
I think that makes sense. It's definitely an archaic gem, we'll call it that. This is a game I actually did play when I was growing up, and writing the script and replaying the game and just getting prepared for it, I was kind of surprised at just how nostalgic it was for me, because it's not a game I really spent a lot of time thinking about. Not that I really forgot it, but it was just like, oh yeah, that weird game that I had played as a kid. And I actually played it with my sisters. We would all kind of gather around the computer screen and then speculate over how to get through puzzles and to kind of make projections of what we thought the story was about. So pretty interesting game, and I'm super thrilled to talk more about all of that as we get into it.
yeah, why don't we start with like just sort of the premise of Myst? This game involves traveling from various worlds within books, worlds that are constructed through a sort of supernatural art. The authors or craft makers of these books create worlds in the pages of them that you can venture into. And the island of Myst happens to be a hub connecting many other worlds crafted that are crafted in this way. It's not unlike like an internet rabbit hole almost. One idea births a new one. It's a little reminiscent of The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, especially if you go into the library on the Myst Island and read through some of the diaries there. Each one of these follows characters as they venture into and learn more about some of the many worlds within these books. They're just long enough to get your imagination going. The idea of reading someone's account living on an island with strange alien creatures or people.
And then, of course, you take that information with you as you explore these different worlds. And you're sort of finding the pages to some of the books to rescue one of 2 brothers who are at odds with each other, and then the story unravels from there. I think that's a great breakdown. I'm actually going to take us through technical artistry.
Perfect, let's do it.
Its technical design has made the game something of a marvel to unpack. Back in the 90s, there weren't commonplace game engines like we have today, and so the designers had to build their game using whatever tools they deemed necessary. The curious thing about Myst is that it has historically been incredibly difficult to deconstruct, though it finally has been mostly cracked by now. The surface of its mechanics rely on HyperCard, which was a program that wasn't even built for games specifically, but it does allow using buttons to unlock or activate other buttons. Myst tied this to visuals, so instead of clicking a character or an item and that telling the game to play out an animation, flipping a switch in Myst means to swap images or even game states. It uses semi-photorealistic graphics that give the illusion of a game pushing graphical fidelity that was at least 2 generations ahead, not a feat many games have accomplished. This comes with enormous limitations, but the mastery of Myst is that instead of working with the kind of animation work we see with other adventure games, it instead takes a bold, new approach by implementing high-resolution photo images and then makes the objects within the image interactable. Your interactability is limited, but that doesn't matter because the game was built to accommodate the scope of a straightforward point-and-click experience. They say that boundaries breed creativity, which is true, but Myst manages to feel so far outside of 1993 constraints because it smartly chooses a format of a game, that being the point-and-click, as its boundary, and then launches itself into striking new territory, that being the beautifully rendered images. So it kind of sets up these nice guardrails to keep you going. Also, the game being a puzzle point-and-click with a surrealistic world are both elements that double up on the novelty of its efforts. So point-and-click adventure games generally have a focus on solving puzzles, but they frequently rely on character interactions to provide context for the puzzle, and they provide items to use with the world. Myst abolishes both of those elements, which creates 2 effects. First, it makes the experience much more solitary, and secondly, it means you don't need to take the entire theoretical realm of possibilities in order to solve puzzles. People say the puzzles are too hard quite often, but I think when the Miller brothers said they made Myst with the intention of making the puzzles logical, what they meant was you solve them by looking right at them and fiddling with all the components that interact with it, or you otherwise discover a password from a nearby source. And occasionally you might light a match or something, but you have no inventory and no pause menu screen, and all of this makes Myst wildly different from everything outside this side of the 90s. Its goal is total player immersion, and every choice made is done to create an experience that is pretty hard to forget. Putting Myst into your computer becomes the equivalent of opening up a book. There's no health meter, non-diegetic clutter, everything that you see or touch is real, and this is all accomplished in part by the incorporation of those photorealistic graphics. So using these really nice images helped push the concept of games for adults, which is not something most people thought was desirable or even important in the 90s. Of course, Myst would become the best-selling PC game for close to a decade, sparking a new interest in computer gaming, adult gaming, and also redefining an entire genre. Puzzle point-and-click games existed before this, but they almost always featured characters on screen that the player could give commands to. You know, this is your Secret of Monkey Island, Loom,
Right.
Gabriel Knight, all the other stuff that we've been nominated at the Oscarinas. And, you know, by a huge contrast, Myst puts the player into the perspective of the game's protagonist. And so making a realistic world becomes a necessity because, of course, we don't see our world as fuzzy pixels. I think that really does change the dynamic because instead of witnessing a character and giving them commands to do things, you embody that character and you make the choice that's then synonymous with you and the player character. Myst also manages to incorporate FMV, which is full motion video, within the game, and not in a way that leans on filmmaking, which is something that I really admire about it. So full motion video is quite honestly ugly and typically poorly implemented in nearly all the games from this era. I've gone through a fair number of them, and it is just not my style. You can disagree all you like, but they have a major problem, and it's that they put far too much authorial control over the actors and their director, such that they end up looking like really, really shitty movies. And Myst doesn't have that problem. And the difference, of course, is that the FMV scenes are used sparingly and appear as part of the supernatural technology within the game's world. It makes sense to see a real human face because Myst wants the player to feel as though they are truly in the world, and humans obviously know what a real human face is. So it's not like it stops to play a movie for you, or like a crappy one, but rather it just, when there is a character present, they have to look real or have some tangibility to them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting too because they use the sort of staticky, the sort of interference in those books to kind of obscure some of the technical limitations as well. So you don't have to have as much processing power to render the entire video if you can break it up into smaller chunks between static.
Yeah, and that's like a great example of them just being really smart with how they utilize a tool instead of just slapping it on there because it's
Yeah.
the new hip thing, you know.
Yeah.
And this is getting a little bit into direction, but there's an interesting comparison to be made with silent films. So silent movies employ title cards to explain important context-sensitive exposition. Recently, I actually watched all the films that were nominated for Best Picture at the very first Oscar ceremony, and I was just really surprised to find how frequent title cards were used. Some of the storylines for those movies are layered and complicated, and the necessity of title cards just became too much at some point. It would just like stop every, minute or so to tell me something that barely connected to like making that connection was just so much work. And funnily enough, the film that's best remembered from that year is Sunrise, a story that tells us basically everything we need to know without words. And it's actually on the Sight and Sound top 100 films of all time because I think it can handle being scrutinized since it understands its limitations and utilizes or what it has available to accomplish the goal. Sunrise doesn't turn its movie into a novel, and neither does Myst turn itself into a movie, and so I really appreciate that.
One con that people have with Myst is that a few of the important interactable objects are obscured by the game's own visuals. Too realistic leads to a darkened area or a hard-to-spot object, and yet it's pretty easy to maintain that this elevates the experience because that's how our real world is. Nowadays, everything has some kind of non-diegetic outline or arrows, yellow paint to mark that this is the path to go, or markers to let you know what's important. But if we imagine a game today that trusts the player as much as Myst does, and simply doesn't bother to make things abundantly obvious, we kind of imagine something that's a little bit more freeing. Naturally, this approach won't work for everyone, but Myst isn't a long game. We're talking 5 to 6 hours at most, and getting a little bit stuck obviously isn't that bad of a thing as it would be in a long 100+ hour experience. So despite the lack of guidance in a few places, the fact that Myst trusts its players enough to not gamify its world is a true mark of quality. When games like Elden Ring are praised for not having cluttered UIs, it makes you realize how great of an execution Myst was for this concept 30 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's part of why it's remained in the public consciousness for so long. It's something that, 30 years later, we're still touting as a tremendous achievement in game design when you can have everything be explained to the player without needing all of the non-diegetic elements to get your point across.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to put into words, but few games are able to capture this really eerie, uncomfortable sense of liminal space that Myst, I think, does really well. I think that would be like the other aspect to it is just that there's something truly unsettling and intriguing about its environments, the strange, surreal collection of items out of place in unusual rooms. And given that the iconography is so restrained, there's nothing that ever impedes the player experience from the game world. Nothing ever interrupts the player from looking and existing in the world of Myst. So that kind of, I think, hopefully starts to give a picture for the technical side and why it was so important for pulling off the vision that they had for this game.
I think the thing I want to add about a little bit about the sort of design of the UI is that going into this game, my partner told me that this was a horror game, and I think that has something a lot to do with this sort of way you're captured by the world, this forced perspective that you're put into of this main character. You go to strange places, and it's quiet. And you see very strange things that you can interact with, but they don't have, some of them don't necessarily have a game effect. It's just, if you can open a box and there's a severed body part in there, and you're like, cool, that's terrifying. I don't want to play this alone.
Yeah. Actually, you're right. Now that I'm thinking about it, there's a number of things you can interact with that aren't specifically for puzzles, which is interesting because that's a lot of extra work. So that really shows their thoughtfulness that it's not just functionality. There's also aspects that lend themselves to exploration and discovery. Yeah.
And just that feeling in a world, right? And being allowed to be overjoyed by seeing something that looks pretty when you climb to the top of a tree, or a little bit afraid when you go to an island that's a fortress and has chains and manacles everywhere.
Yeah. Well, even you go into Akonar's rooms and he has like torture devices, and
Yeah.
there's like a monkey skull. He's got some really creepy stuff. And it's
Yeah.
interesting that they're asking you, "Oh, go find the pages and put it back in the book and let me out. Then I'll be free. Don't trust the other guy." And then you get to their rooms, and you're sort of like, "I don't know. This is
This
pretty
is unsettling.
uncomfortable."
Yeah, yeah.
I was doing some research, and someone had commented on how there's so much environmental storytelling in the game, and I actually think that's really true. And some of it is pretty heavy-handed. You could look at the torture devices and think to yourself, okay, well, he's obviously the bad guy. I don't want to trust him. But I mean, I can't really think of too many other games that had such an emphasis on telling the story entirely through the environment. I think I mentioned that point a little bit with Castlevania last year, but it wasn't so much about a specific narrative. It was more about creating, setting up the puzzle pieces for the player to experience something that would then prompt a story of their own to tell. But Myst has like a specific direction it's trying to get to. It's open-ended in its conclusions, but there's a number of like key ingredients you're gonna need to pick up on. And so I actually think they did a nice job of making sure those details are there, just so that way you can kind of mull it over as you're exploring. And of course, this is tying us back to our direction. I've got actually two core tenets that I think makes the direction in Myst so interesting. And the first is it's this believability through a naturalistic world. And then the second is that the gameplay is secondary rather than the primary focus. And the actual end result the Rand brothers are looking for is to spark that imagination. So I'm going to have to a few more thoughts, I think, to kind of break down, I think, or the reasons for why I think this works. So onto that first one, what makes the game more believable? Well, it's mostly from a series of crucially important choices. It's the choice of realistic graphics via the JPEG images, choice for limited FMV, which is great because it means characters appear as real people rather than pixel art drawings. This also means there's no need for text boxes, which is great because text boxes don't spontaneously emerge in our real-life context. And then there's also the fact that the game is from that first-person perspective, so what the player sees is what the character sees, and vice versa. This is actually an interesting point, too, because you were talking about the kind of extreme emphasis the game places on that. Because we've seen first-person games before this. You had Wolfenstein, you have Doom. But I think in Myst it's a little different because there's so little that you can interact with. The few things that you can and the few things that you can't that are present in the game become intensified, right?
Right.
It honestly kind of reminds me a little bit of Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane being one of the most influential films ever made. And part of what makes it so great is there was an effort from Orson Welles and cinematographer Greg Toland to have everything in the shot in focus. And the reason was that in real life, everything is in focus for the human eye. Therefore, so should the way we view the film. There are things that don't always translate realistically. For example, your movement in Myst is done through a series of jump cuts, which is obviously not realistic. And then the water is pretty stagnant, so that's not realistic. But, you gotta take it into context, because Citizen Kane is in black and white, even though most people see the world in color. So there are concessions that we accept because of technical limitations. At some point, the Rand brothers had to decide how to depict their world, and making something appear real helped reach their target audience of adults and non-gamers. So I think the trade-off was worth it. They had to buckle down and decide, is it worth it to have these really nice images if it means that there's a few things that don't quite add up? And I would say that it was. I think it definitely reached a far greater audience, and, history speaks for itself for that one.
Yeah, I agree. The Rand brothers actually co-created their studio, Scion Studios, based on the image of a clear blue sky. It's interesting to note that they were, in some sense, outsiders to this realm of games. They're quoted as saying, "We weren't really game designers, we were place designers. So we just started drawing maps, and the maps kind of fueled the story." I think this line really does sum up the game, because for a lot of us, even and especially those of us who enjoy Myst, we can freely admit that Myst is a great place to be in, and not necessarily a game to play. I attribute this as a rare good quality. Would it be better if the game was more fun? I mean, maybe. So there are differing positions people have regarding whether or not they believe games have a necessity to be fun, but I think this adds credibility to the idea that Myst is more art than it is game. So we can talk about its design missteps all we want, but at the end of the day, Myst is a game that definitely gets people talking. We're talking. This is a long conversation we're having about this. And that's irrespective of what the stance that they have on the medium.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, part of Cyan's tenets for game philosophy was that they wanted it to be point and click, they wanted a first-person point of view, they wanted the player as the main character, and then they wanted everything to be explorable. And that outsider perspective of two guys who weren't super nerds actually, I think it does help. I agree, because they wanted to capture experiences that are more broad-reaching. Myst has more literary influence than film anyways, and you can see that inspiration by the fact that you're transported through books. According to Rand, Lord of the Rings felt like the world was much bigger, felt like you had a window, you were just experiencing a small window into a much larger world, and for some reason that really resonated with us, they're quoted saying. And so when it came to time to do our worlds, that's naturally where we land. We build backstory, wrap stuff up, or wrap stuff around the family and what had happened. Stuff didn't even need to be told in the little window of the Myst game, but in our world, it gave it weight, and I love that. And they also have said to create a world not necessarily for a story, but create a world that tells a story through its physicality. So I really find all of this stuff absolutely fascinating as a inspiration point to build this game, because it differs so much from something like Contra, for example, where it's clearly a bunch of developers who are very skilled at their craft, and they're pushing the medium to create an experience that we've seen, but to do it in a more polished and refined way. But here, it's totally new territory. Everything is fresh, and everything is just being replicated from what they conjure up in their imagination. And so there's a real purity in their inspiration, I think. I mean, you can see that from the stripped back interface. It's high resolution graphics, the FMV stuff. Everything Myst does wants to create a space that is in one sense believable. And to kind of add to that environment, something else I really like is the effort to make the space interesting and novel. You know, you read a book in the library about Akinar's Chronicles and other worlds, sort of like a Jules Verne novel. Coincidentally, the title for Myst was inspired by Verne's The Mysterious Island, with a Y. And then you can physically go there yourself and see what has happened to that world. And this is one of those mind-opening strategies that ignites a sense of curiosity and wonderment. You encounter tools and mechanics, logic puzzles that are familiar to us from our real world, mixed with the fever dream environments, and the combination makes for an experience that is decidedly compelling. That said, the game does lack conclusions on a number of accounts that will be frustrating for some, but there's no denying that Myst was a trailblazer here. Sure, it's not the Shakespeare of games, but I do think it's a title every gaming enthusiast should probably experience.
Yeah, I agree. And there's more highlights of the direction than I think what we've stated. Besides its stripped back interface, it has a lack of characters to speak with, which means everything really does have to be figured out as a result of the world communicating what it wants to say to the player. For example, there's a puzzle involving sending water through pipes in a tree gate, and you can only really solve this by listening. You have to listen to hear if the water is flowing or not. This shows the developers are playing by real-world rules. They trust their players can use their own senses to figure out if they are making progress or not. And they actually did make a considerable effort to make Myst an approachable experience. For play testers, for example, they always had two players who could talk to one another and share ideas. They would then be editing the game simultaneously in the background. If they saw a player click to go to a location, for example, but the radius for this invisible button was too small, they would open it. And, this is stuff that's all really easy to take for granted, but Myst plays smoothly because they didn't. You get around the island without having to fight the controls or feel like you need to do everything perfectly. And I also do think that this two-player testing system really validates the reality of how this game was played so much more cooperatively back in the 90s, and even today, this is how I played it. I really do feel like this single-player only label is somewhat of a misnomer, because even if you're playing it for the first time with someone who's already played it, they're still participating in your frustration. I can say that from experience.
Yeah, so actually, I'm kind of curious to poke more about that. Like, so, okay, I have two questions for you. First is,
Okay.
did she feel like, was she just enjoying your frustration? Like, did you get too frustrated or did she get too bored? Like, what was the kind of end result of your emotional, I guess, playthrough of this
It's
game?
so I'm gonna call her out a little bit. I think she'd forgotten a lot of the solutions, but wanted
Okay.
to be smug and like I know exactly what's going on. There is, I think you alluded to this earlier. There's the point with the match, and I spent like about I think she knew this one because I spent like 30 minutes running around inside the house trying to figure out what to do with this match, only to realize like, oh, you have to light it. And like at that point when I figured that out, she did like start laughing. So it was like, okay, you remembered that one, but I feel like you remember that one because you did the same thing when you were playing. So
So she's just leeching off of the frustration that she had experienced back in the day, it sounds like.
I think so. I think it was cathartic for her. And like
Yeah, it's a better way to put it.
obviously she was doing some of her own things as well because I think it would be very boring to, especially like the first 30 45 minutes of the game. I just was walking around reading books because I found books and I
Yeah.
was like, I can interact with these. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I'm gonna read all these books. Um, and then like I eventually had to be just like, okay, you have to give me a hint, right? Like I don't know what's going on. These books are just stories. They don't tell me how to play the game. Is this the game? Do I just go around reading books? I guess technically that is the game, but you more run around experiencing books, I guess. So
Hmm.
she did help me out eventually, but there was a lot of points where I was just like, "Tell me," and she was like, "No, no, I don't think I will."
Okay, question number two then. Did by the end of it, did she or did both of you agree that it was still a horror game for you guys?
We haven't really talked about the ending, so
Hmm.
I ended up playing the ending separately by myself, just because
Okay.
I had to finish it to be able to talk about it intelligently. Um, and I guess some very slight spoilers. I chose to trust someone, and that was maybe the wrong idea. Uh, so I lost. Honestly, it is a very it's a disturbing way to lose, I think. Like there's something
Yeah.
existentially disturbing about it, but it's existential, I think, as far as horror goes, a lot more than I think I thought it was going to be like environmental horror.
Yeah, because conceptually it's terrifying because you don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we're not. Well, this is going to be a full spoiler review. I'll probably play the footage
Okay.
right now as we're speaking. So, who did you end up trusting?
I ended up trusting Blue Guy, who I think is not
Akinar. Okay.
Akinar. Is that Akinar? I did end up
Yeah.
trusting Akinar. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. And he told me like there was like even a moment where I was playing through the end and he's like, "Don't touch the green book," and I was like, I really feel like that's telling me to touch the green book. Like I feel like that's the game saying, but at the same time, I was like, I'm so confused by the conventions of this game. This is so like far removed that maybe like I actually should just trust this person. Um,
Yeah.
and then I got trapped in a book, and it's like it's a good ending. It's a very good ending, like from a storytelling point of view, because you spend this time going to worlds that are books, that are ideas that are fully fleshed out, and to lose means you're sent to a world that is a book that contains nothing. And that
Oof.
is so horrifying to think about.
You're just in this void of
You're
yeah.
just in this void, and that's like terrifying. But it isn't the same sort of horror that I think I was kind of expecting going into it from my partner saying like this is going to be a
Okay.
horror game.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's no zombies, there's no like, graphic violence or any of those things. But the existential horror is a
Yeah.
refreshing taste because I mean it's cheap horror is so easy to come by. It's nice to see something that will really mess with your head and like you said, it does fit from a storytelling perspective because that's exactly what it conditioned you to think from the very start that all of this is going to be very existential and very
Hmm.
abstract and surreal, and so having an ending that fits in with that does make a lot of sense,
Yeah.
terrifying as it is. Yeah, I think actually I remember playing the game as a kid and thinking to myself that initially I want to trust the blue guy, and the red guy I don't trust as much because the blue guy just seems desperate. That's how he comes across to
Yeah.
me. Like he's just really like hoping for a bone. But then as you give them more pages, the narrative started to shift in my head, and I started to feel like the blue guy was getting more like, I don't know, just antagonistic towards me, whereas Sirius had a more thoughtful explanation that if I just gave him more red pages, he would continue to explain in greater detail the complexities. And so I remember feeling like initially I'm supposed, like thinking to myself, I'm supposed to dislike the red guy, but if I keep trusting him, I'll eventually, like he is ultimately the good guy. And then the blue guy, I'm supposed to start trusting and then eventually feel betrayed, which is why, you know, you're taking the pages back and you kind of want to give pages to both of them because you're curious to see like what more information you can gather. I don't know that this was totally replicated when I replayed it, but it was something that like came back to me as a memory that I had.
Yeah, I
And
think it's interesting that you can only hold one page and take one page from the world at a time, though. Like this was like, and again, maybe I'm reading too much into this with a modern sort of gaming perspective, because you don't have an inventory. You have a hand you can hold things in, and then I guess your other hand is for opening books.
yeah.
But I remember like I did the first two where I gave both the pages and I would go back into the world and give the page and then come back out. And then for the third one I was just like, I think it wants me to make a decision. I think this game is through its mechanics trying to force me to be like, no, you have to start choosing which one to go for. And so I was like, well, blue seems right. This Akinar guy seems like he's more in a state of desperation, less in a state of control, and I want to be a good person and help him.
I think that's on point because that was very much because it's a weird break from this believability, right? Where suddenly, you mean I don't have two hands or I can't hold two pieces of paper in my hand at once?
Yeah.
You know, that doesn't really make sense, but you're right because it actually funnels back into now like an important narrative indication where it says, no, your character has to commit to one of these two. You cannot do both. And you start to recognize that as you're going through it, being like, I can only choose one, so who am I going to decide? Because every time you go into a world, it's going to force you to pick one. And it's this really uncomfortable feeling, because I always want to grab both. I'm like, why do I have to make a second trip back here? Like, I want to take both. Yeah. But the game is trying to tell you, like, no, like, you in this story are going to need to decide who you want. You can go back and forth and get the other page if you want, but you're really overexerting yourself by trying to help both. Yeah. And it's not to say that there aren't some, like, you know, questionable choices with some of the more difficult design puzzles as well. But I actually heard that people got their grandmothers to play it back in the day. So, I mean, how hard is it really?
Depends on whether or not you're trying to figure out how to do a match. That's really like honestly, that and the not find, because there's like at the beginning of the game there's a page on the ground and I just didn't find that. Those are like those are the two places where I spent like an hour each just running around trying to figure out what to do. So
okay, so that's interesting because that page I heard was something they added as a result of playtesters not enjoying the game. They felt like they just had no emotional investment, and so they added that page in there as a way to be an inciting incident, so you could read it and go, oh, okay, so there's a situation happening here, and then you start to get involved.
Honestly, for the longest time, I really thought I was the mom of the two kids, or like the guy who wrote the page was like my husband who was going to try and like save his kids. Like I thought that was the character I was playing, and eventually I realized like, okay, no, I'm just a random person who somehow showed up in this. But yeah,
that would have made sense though. That would have been an interesting twist if you're really Catherine, because I mean, it would obviously change how the characters interact with you, but it's possible that they may not be able to make you out very well either, because the static, and you can see this when you are trapped in the book, it starts to become staticky and all confused as they rip the pages out. So, yeah. I mean, a lot of this is coming down to, you know, just like total lack of modern conveniences. So, like, on the one hand, it sucks to have you, like, wander around an island for an hour or, like, to just mess with a match for a half hour. I'm not going to say that that's great design. I think that's where Myst comes under fire in more recent memory. But there's still a pretty ardent fan base, and I think it's because for a lot of people, the ends they justify these decisions being made. You can
Hmm.
talk about how flawed it is, and it is. Like, yeah, you shouldn't set that situation up for a player, but there is something totally immersive about the fact that it is just that degree of hands off, and it wants its no, you and the game world, and that's that. And that commitment, I think, is, I mean, you gotta say, that's at least commendable.
Yeah, I agree.
And these are all ideas that they, wanted it to be about from the beginning. Like they made a pitch to Activision, and they said that the game would feature a non-linear story. It would be for an older audience. The player would be the protagonist. You'd have believable characters. You'd have ethics and consequences, and you'd have emotional provocation. And these are some really lofty ambitions
Hmm.
to aspire to in the 90s, because so many games were just, you would hop on and design something for Super Nintendo, or you do like a Doom project, and it's
Hmm.
meant to be fun. It's meant to have gameplay first. I think there's a real need then, and especially now, for games that aren't necessarily so concerned with this emphasis on like gameplay, but rather just experience, right? And the novel
Right.
things you can create with that. So I think that'll kind of segue us into talking about Best Pixel. So I think I'll just briefly kind of cover some of the other elements that it wasn't nominated for, namely writing. I think it's pretty well written. The sound
Hmm.
design's good, the music is good, and the interface is fantastic. But the trouble was, many of these elements are so minimalistic that it's very difficult to talk about them for long. The writing, for the most part, is like equal parts compelling and well acted. But when compared with games like Dragon Quest or Star Control 2, the script is like, an eighth of that size, maybe. And this makes it hard to argue points and to showcase it. Technically, you could include the diary entries in the library, but these are like self contained narratives that build upon the world of Myst more so than they add to the game's plot. And
Hmm.
then, you look at like the music, which is excellent, but its implementation is sometimes questionable since it only plays while you're in specific places and can abruptly cut in and out as you enter and exit the room. And that was actually an interesting thing that I was thinking about when I played it, because I went through the game kind of fast and I noticed that choppy sensation, but
Yeah.
I don't remember it feeling that way back in the day. Like, I just remember us taking such a long time with the game, and every screen seemed to matter so much to us, and we would just pause and look around and like take in the environment. And that's really how Myst wants to be played, but I think it's super difficult to adjust your brain. I mean, it's like reading epic poetry, right? Or something from, a
Hmm.
bygone era like Beowulf. It's like there's a lot in there that's going to be difficult to acclimate your mind to experience. So it's interesting just how archaic some of this comes across. It definitely has more strengths than its nomination count reveals, only holding about half of the nominations that I think it could and probably should have gotten. I think the sound one was probably a big miss, seeing as how
That's
you use that
yeah.
for puzzles.
That was something that I thought. I mean, like I think again, it does feel like a product of its time somewhat. This sort of sound design as like using sound as a puzzle, but it's still so intuitive, and it does that without having to like explain it to you. Like, hey, here's what each of these sounds mean, and it carries across the different like kind of islands that you go to as well. Like the fortress island kind of teaches you about like different sounds meaning different directions, and then you go to the one with the minecart, which is all about sound. Like it's an entire world that's just like, hey, pay attention to sound. And then you have that reused, and it feels very natural if you happen to play it that way, right? Like again, this is
Mm-hmm.
one of the flaws of like these sort of non-linear story focuses that
Construction.
Cyan Studios, yeah, put on their game is they wanted it to be able to be like played in any order, and sometimes that means your individual like levels, I guess you could say, feel a little bit more self-contained and a little bit more disjointed from each other, especially if you play them in the quote unquote wrong order.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I still like can't. I really can't help but praise the sound design still. Like it didn't tell me anything, and I still was like, this makes sense, and
Yeah.
that's a pretty strong. I want to say condemnation, but that's not the right word.
Oh, well, like an argument, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I want to stick on that puzzle for a minute, actually, because that puzzle where you're in the mine and you have to choose the directions based on the sound of where to go,
Mm-hmm.
it's like notoriously cited as the worst puzzle in the game, and people find it
Oh
difficult
yeah.
and unintuitive. So was that your experience with it as well?
I think it was long, I think, more than anything. I
Okay.
think once like I got into the flow of it and I remembered, hey, haven't I heard these sounds before on a different island and they meant something there? I was like, "Oh, I get this." But then I went back to the very beginning. I pressed like the I think I actually accidentally made my way back to the beginning. I go back and I was just like, oh my god, I'm so frustrated with this. And then like I was like, okay, wait, think about the sounds. What did those mean? And then like I got through it and I got the pattern and I wasn't backtracking. I was hearing the sounds every like junction I made it to. But I was like, this is so long. This goes on for such a long time, and I get it. And I think that's one of my least favorite designs of puzzles is when you
I was
understand everything that they're trying to tell you, but the game has lagged behind so much more than your understanding. Like there's the point where they
okay.
play two
Yeah.
sounds at once, and it's supposed to mean like this is the north sound, this is the west sound. They're played at once. It means go northwest. I'm like
Right.
clever, and then it keeps going for
For a
like
very
five
long
more
time.
minutes. Yeah, so I think like there's something, and I'm wondering since they talk so much about like how they started off with like maps, if they were trying to make it so that this led you to a place on a map they had constructed, and they had to make it so that winding rail path actually led you to the place they'd already pre-constructed, instead of saying like, you know what, here's a good ending point, we're just going to put the ending here.
Mm-hmm. It's such a fascinating puzzle because the brothers actually disagree on its reception. One of them thinks it's terrible and it was their worst puzzle designed, but the other
Hmm.
is a staunch defender of it. And he said that he thinks it's fascinating how you can use a sound puzzle to get to this particular island or this world, and then the entire island is all about sound. It's nothing but
Yeah.
sound puzzles, and then you get to that end there and suddenly the player thinks to themselves, I can't figure it out, it's too hard. He's like, but it's about sound, you had all the pieces right there.
Yeah.
um
I think that's again, I think I agree. Like, and I think when I figured out, like, oh, wait, this is just what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to pay attention to the sounds. I will say, however, against that argument, the first few sounds you hear are all the same sound. Like, you just hear north, 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 or something like
yeah,
that. If you get
misleading.
stuck in those first three parts, you're just like, what? Am I just supposed to go straight when I hear a sound? And, like, yeah, you are. But like that's the thing you learn, and then you hear a different sound, and you're like, okay, I'm just supposed to go straight again, and that's wrong.
Right. Well, you're not allowed to go straight again the first time that sound happens. You
Oh, it
have to
isn't. Yeah,
like
you're right.
turn. So like it's there, but for some reason
Yeah.
it just doesn't sink in for a lot of people because you're not alone. Like clearly, I mean, most people are frustrated by that puzzle. I think I'm actually in a weird exception because I actually solved that one by myself when I was a kid, just
Hmm.
because I mean, as a kid, you have a lot of time in your hands. You're not really pressed for too many things, and so I would just go through, and then I started to figure out, oh, it's these sounds, and then I was like, man, it'd be nice if I could write these down, but it's a sound, I can't write it down, so I'm just gonna have to remember. And so then I had to like basically train my mind to figure it out. And I remember getting to the end and being like, oh wow, that was really satisfying. But that's so this is like a rare exception. Almost all of the other puzzles in Myst just totally eluded me as a kid, and I was really bad at the game, and my sisters basically solved everything, and I just kind of fumbled along. But it's strange
Hmm.
how the one puzzle that everybody finds so unintuitive and difficult is like the one puzzle that I was like, yeah, it's just pattern recognition. I can do this.
No, that I think that makes sense. I think, and again, I didn't spend a whole hour trying to get lost in getting lost in the mine carts. I did get it pretty. I did get it eventually, but it was like one of those things where I'm like, okay, I have to stop and think about this. How does Myst want me to solve this problem? And I think like it's that sort of wearing its own sort of like design signature, its own signature puzzles on its sleeve, and being like, this is the way you solve this. It's like most exacerbated in that puzzle, right? It's the most like you actually have to stop and think. You can't wander around and do something else, because if you wander around in that puzzle, you're lost in the caves.
I think I would have probably, like, I think it lets you get lost a little too easily,
Yeah.
perchance. Like, I think maybe it would have, because, like, if you go a wrong direction, then it doesn't always just send you back to the beginning. It feels like it
Yeah.
just sends you into a little bit of a spiral until you get back to the
Which
beginning.
wouldn't be realistic if it just sent you back to the beginning. Like that is fair. I
Okay, yeah.
understand that. But I think like that frustration of like you find yourself back at the beginning and you start going all the way back up, and it's that long kind of scene of going back up into the above part, and you're like, did I find it? And then it's like, no, this is just where you were. You're like, okay, Myst, you got me.
So this is kind of fascinating too, because what we're saying here is pretty much just that it's very much a product of its time. But then, like, at the same token, you can't really deny the enormous impact the game has had. It elevated the Macintosh computer and promoted the idea of buying a computer solely for a new video game. That was crazy. I remember seeing it on store shelves and it's being like right next to the electronics section and not really seeing other PC games next to it, but just like copies of Myst. And being like, wow, it's like synonymous with buying this computer, which is just crazy to think about.
Yeah, and honestly, this is the reason I didn't play this game is because I didn't have a Mac. I was like, oh, okay, I can't do that. that's
Well, that was like so common too. Like people would buy the Macintosh computer like just to play this game.
Yeah,
which is like wild to think about a game selling. I mean, a game sell consoles. Sure, we've heard of that, but to sell like a PC, it's like, oh, well, that is a different situation. Okay, so I got a question for you, because this is very much a change in format to your typical point-and-click adventure game. They wanted to make it more attractive to adults, and so part of that is the realistic graphics, the challenging puzzles, but the things that, or rather the puzzles that utilize real-world objects, and the more mature storyline. But importantly, unlike The Secret of Monkey Island, Loom, Sam & Max, King's Quest, Gabriel Knight, all those other games, I don't feel like the emphasis is quite on entertainment, because those games have like humor or wit, and Myst has no problems abandoning all of that in favor of just letting the players sit still with the world and conjure interpretations for themselves. It appeals to that different demographic of people, which I would include myself into, even though I'm not a big point and click fan. This is like the one game where I can kind of get on board with it, because I don't really like being the surrogate who hits the play button for each chapter of a primitive movie. And this is like, I like being in control of my avatar in the game and being able to set the pace of the experience for myself. So I wonder, like, I think there's a lot of friction when that happens just naturally when you play this game. And I wondered how much you feel the friction hurts its potential here for like a best pixel slot. Like, do you think it's too much on a personal level, or do you feel like it was justified for what it was trying to accomplish?
I think I do have to feel like it was justified for what it was trying to accomplish. I think like I walked away from this game being like, wow, that was very good. And I think cards on the table, I think after I started playing it for a little bit, I was like, well, this should be, we had a conversation. I was like, this should be a best pixel nomination. We should put this one in for best pixel, because I was very like occupied with it. Like it kind of stuck in my thoughts. I get that it did away with that sort of expectation of like having a humorous plot or having the goal of entertainment, but I think what it sacrificed that for was like a real thoughtfulness and a real, like, I almost want to say like sincerity, even though like it is still just a game in quotes, right? Like it is still just like this 5 to 6 hour experience. There was a real, I think it did have like this very strange but real connection to me as a player, where I did feel like I'm absorbed in this, and in a way that I don't think I've ever felt in a point and click adventure game. Like going back to that thought where I was like, oh, I must be Catherine, I must be the mom, right? I quickly kind of discarded that idea in favor of being like, no, I'm just me. Just the kind of person that showed up. Like at first I was like, this is a note left for me because it's just sitting there on the ground. The code that is in that note, or the thing that says to do in the note, is not like pre-put into the console that you go down and put the code into. So I was like, okay, so I can infer a couple things about that. One, Catherine has not shown up, and two, if I'm a person that shows up, I'm probably Catherine. But then I kind of just got to discard that idea and kind of just got to be like, no, this is okay. I just kind of stumbled upon this place, and that let me easily take away the things that Myst wanted me to take away from it by letting me be me, I guess. Does that make sense?
It does. I think so, because it lets you decide what it is you're going to take away from it, and so it's an open-ended choice, and that gives that sincerity is that it's giving the player the agency to make those decisions for themselves, and it trusts you to make them. And that's definitely contrary to a lot of other games. Like, some people have compared it with Doom and said, like, Doom is like, move and shoot, but Myst is stop and think. And they're both valuable perspectives. When you're talking about games, move and shoot is more synonymous with quote-unquote gaming. And, you embody the Doom guy. So you embody the narrative of killing all these demons. And there's, all these justifications that they create so that way things make sense in the game world. But they don't necessarily have to make sense in reality. Whereas Myst is interested in that dynamic. That's the interplay that it's actually more interested in, which almost makes it this reflective piece. I mean, imagine all the missteps they could have had. They could have easily put a mirror in the game and had you walk up and look at yourself. But how jarring would that have been? Such a small detail, like one room, one screen of a mirror so you could see your character would just completely undermine so many of the things that it's trying to accomplish. Yeah, so its technical prowess are really just magic tricks. But, how fitting it is for a game about concealed truths. When we first arrive in Myst, we know so little. We don't know who built these worlds. We don't know why. We don't know who we can trust. Everything is shrouded in mist. All we can do is bring what we know from our real life experiences and put them to the task before us. There's a total synergy between this player and avatar. And that's where, its strength in interface makes so much sense, but it was just really challenging to talk about, because I think I really teetered when I was putting it down for nominations. I had it there, but there was just all this hesitation because I'm like, I don't even know how to describe that. How do I articulate how great of an interface that does nothing is? But it's the fact that they have to then recontextualize the whole world, because they're like, but the player needs to know where to go and what to do, so it has to have something here. And it's just fascinating that this extra challenge that they had to they put upon themselves.
Yeah, it really is a hard thing to talk about when you're talking about sort of the way in which this game actually impresses upon you, because one of the questions that's so typically asked about what a game is what do you do in this game? And what do you do in Myst? You just kind of walk around. And I feel there's more acceptance of this in the modern world. We have walking simulator games that are very concerned about you just kind of wandering around, being this nameless point of view character and finding a story through that. But there's nothing you really do in this game. You solve puzzles, I guess. There's kind of a mystery. You have to get a page to a book. But those are such weird concepts to sort of try and sell a game on. And for some reason, this game was, on that premise, one of the top selling games of the 90s.
How does that happen?
Yeah. And we even struggled trying to figure out how to talk about this game before we started recording. We were like, okay, we have to start with the technical part, right? That's the actual foundation, because otherwise we can't explain why this is good if we don't talk about how it technically rendered the world and how it redesigned the world completely within these confines in order to tell a story. That world that we could see was a window to that story. The story was a window through which we could see that world, I think, is the simile we used. Yeah,
well, I mean, you have mentioned it, I think, before too, where it's a game where it basically just takes all of the conventions we know and take for granted about games and just throws them out the window. Everything's gone, and we're just starting with a clean slate. It's just this really fascinating expose. When you mentioned too, now we have walking sims, and this is just such a common game format now. But those games, they just talk at you. It's why I can't stand them. It's because it's just a character reading stuff to me or explaining things to me.
Yep.
And in Myst, it's done that way. It's honestly similar to something like Metroid Prime, where you scan the terminal and read it, or you pick up the book off the shelf and read it. And it's such a small thing, but it makes such a profound difference to a player, because you make these decisions, and there's so much agency
Yeah.
and like validation for like you existing in this world. I get where this is such an unusual specimen, because it's just so like there's no other game like Myst even now, even when you get to like other point and click or puzzle or walking sims, the way they handle and address these fundamental concerns is just completely different. And I think
Yeah.
that's partly why it just maintains itself. It's honestly, it's a lot like books. It's a lot like being transported into a book, because you have to imagine. You've got to
Yeah.
imagine all the spaces. The, author gives you some hints, but you have to create it yourself. And so that's a real challenge. And I don't think people are used to getting that from their gaming entertainment. And I think that's partly where some of the like confusion comes in with the puzzle design, because they're looking at this going, oh, well, this is hard because I have to just really exercise my thoughts here and figure out how things are going to connect and fit together so that I can piece together more about this world. But like, it doesn't give you an easy way out. It doesn't let you bring up a tutorial or have a hint system. There's nothing like that. It's just kind of like, well, but the world exists this way. And then you take a step back and you go, well, I do appreciate that it's trying to replicate certain aspects of real life in such an honest way.
I agree. I do have to. Okay. I think we're kind of skipping ahead because I'm going to talk about how I played this very quickly. I played this on the Switch just because you said hint system, and I did discover that on the Switch, on the version I was playing with, I accidentally discovered a hint system. I didn't know what I was looking at. I backed out immediately, but there is a hint system in that version, so I almost cheated. I thought about it. I thought about it when I got to the match, and I was like, what the hell do I do?
Yeah, okay, so that's such a dicey topic too, because obviously you want people to play the game and experience it, but like, does it like impede on like the original vision? I don't know. That's a hard question.
Yeah. It's very strange, and like I think it's such a fascinating question in the lens of like the gaming landscape we live in now, where you can, if you get stuck on a puzzle or you're looking for a specific item in a game, look it up online. So many games have like their own wikis with that you can use to just find the thing you're looking for, and that seems to be accepted. And like, it's more. The games themselves are not about necessarily like, oh, you have to do this challenge to get this reward. It's more about like, if you want this reward and you want to have fun playing with this reward, here's how you get it, right? Mm-hmm. Which is a different like sort of, I guess, perspective to look at this idea of looking things up with. But it's also like one that, we live in an age of the internet where information is accessible at our fingertips at any time. We should probably just embrace it. So, like, people are going to give hints on how to do things on the internet. So I'm not going to disparage that, but it is so strange to see it in this old game that is very much about like the esoteric and the practical within the esoteric.
Yeah, like, I mean, even the title, Myst, it's sort of like mystery, Myst with an I, and then myth with a Y, all of which involves like obscuration, intangibility. It's like navigational or deductive mind to solve or disrupt or dissipate. And the implication that like there's like these deeper truths existing somewhere in the fog. Whether or not this deeper truth can be discovered isn't clear, but it's not a story about clarity. So I think we kind of do a bit of a disservice by assuming, the game lacks vision or identity or authorial intent. It's like, whoa, that's totally not true. Like, the characters in the books, they're shrouded in static. When their voices become more distinct, they conceal crucial truths about their intentions. So even when you're like, oh, I'm repairing these books and I'm clearing up the image here, it's like, no, they're misleading you. They're telling you more, and it's like, we shouldn't even be listening to these guys.
Yeah, I think you have I think after playing the game, I'm like, you may have a better understanding of these characters when they're very staticky, honestly, because they're just like, that's a clear representation of what these characters are. It's a thing that's used, a mechanic that's used a lot in book storytelling, right? Where you say on the first page, you have to give an idea of what this character is. Like, the first page a character shows up, here's what the character is. And like, first page of the book that you see these characters on, actually a book, is there's so much obscuring of their true intentions, or not their true intentions, but their true like personalities, I guess. And the only thing that actually is made clear is their intention that they don't want you to help their brother, right? They don't want you to help the other. And that is true throughout the game, throughout the reading of their books. Even as you get more clarity, you realize it's a lot of it is just like a repetition of that singular intention of not having you help the other person, and a concealing as things become less concealed in the static, in the actual physicality of the book. They conceal more and more what their intention is with you.
And that's like so fascinating too, because you're like, I love the phrase you said where you're reading their books. It's like you're reading their narratives, their perspectives when you open their books, which is exactly what you do in real life when you open a book, is you're getting an author's take or perception of the world. And so the brothers have this view that they're the innocent one. It wasn't my fault, and it's someone else's fault. They're to blame. And so they're like literally trapped within their limited perception of things. But then there's like this twist on that narrative when you discover that their father, who is not dead, he's very much alive, but he's trapped in Dunny, this other book. And when you talk to him, he's so much more approachable, and he's like almost represents like enlightenment or something like that. Like he reads the books and gains the knowledge, and he recounts his experiences in the journaling, and then he helps you. He's not able to send you home though, which is like another curious bit. Like he sends you back to the world of Myst, and he's like, and you can come visit me, we can go back and forth because I have the linking book now. But that's about where we're at so far. And so you can enjoy the library at your leisure. And so you're left, like the game, it's like an anticlimactic ending, but you're left to just study and read books and enjoy yourself. And it's sort of like the world you've been in now takes on like a different light, which is just like so fascinating. All of these specific little choices that they've made. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I feel like it just validates so much of like the Myst narrative, the fact that it comes alive in like a conversation about it more so than just almost even like playing. But you kind of have to play. You have to sit there and struggle with it before you can get to this end result that's really rewarding.
Yeah, in a way, in that way, it is kind of like a book that's challenging to read. But then you get to talk about it with someone else who's read the book, and you get to share those experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad I got to touch on that sort of like, what does it look like to have a hint system in this game, and how does that make us feel on our knee-jerk reactions? But yeah, that's not the game we're talking about, really. I was a little worried about bringing that up because we're not talking about that edition of the game, but that is an edition that is out there. And if you're curious to play Myst for yourself, there are plenty of remakes and re-releases across multiple platforms, including on Steam and on the Switch. The one on Steam is the Masterpiece Edition. That's probably the most faithful to the original, I believe. So,
yeah, that's the one that's like $6 or something like that. I mean, that's the version I played. That's what I recommend. Although, like, I'm not going to discredit anyone who wants to use this hint system. I mean, I applaud you for not using it. I admittedly didn't even do that myself when I went through it again, because I was like, I need quality footage here. I can't be sitting around messing with this puzzle for an hour and a half. Because like in real life, you get hints from talking with people, and you know, Myst being something that you play with other people who can then like bring insight or different conclusions. You know, it's not that the game is totally resistant to that idea, but I do think there's definitely a point at which it's too much, where you're just looking through a puzzle solution for every single thing, and then it's like, all right, well, you're not really like engaging with the world so much. So well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us tonight. Myst is up for 3 awards this season, but don't let that fool you, because I think it has a pretty strong standing in most of these categories. Be curious to hear your thoughts on Myst. Do you actually end up engaging in thoughtful conversations as a result of this game? Let us know. Thank you, Tom, so much for coming aboard and talking about Myst. This was very enlightening.
Thank you for having me.
And if Myst wins Best Pixel, it will have recognized an important shift in the art medium of games, honoring a title that continues to free us from the constraints we impose on our creativity and into boundless realms.